Hello BookTube. Sorry if you can hear cat munching sounds in the background. It's Wednesday's dinner time, so she's tucking into some chicken right now. The concept of the personal curriculum is something that's kind of been floating around on the internet for a little while now, and I've always found the idea of setting a personal curriculum quite an interesting one, but I haven't really dived into doing one for a while. I haven't really felt a strong pull to anything in particular. I haven't really felt the motivation to sit down and kind of set myself some goals in terms of learning about a specific topic. As I talked about in my quarter one wrap up, I've really been enjoying, or finding myself enjoying, modern adaptations of myths. I really enjoyed reading The Palace of Eros by Cara de Robertis. It's one of my favourite reads from the first 3 months of 2026. And I also really enjoyed the National Theatre's production of The Bacchae. And obviously, the big film release for 2026 is Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey. And one of my personal reading goals is to read The Odyssey before that adaptation comes out in, I believe it's July. I've never read The Odyssey before. I have read the Iliad, but I've never tackled The Odyssey. And as you can see, he is a beefy boy. And I'm not somebody who reads a lot of classic literature on the regular. So this is a little bit of an intimidating one for me. I have gone for Emily Wilson's translation. I've heard that it's quite accessible. So this is the copy that I've picked up for myself. But I thought before I tackle this beast, I thought it might be quite nice to delve into another area of mythology, start off with a source reference that's maybe a little bit slimmer, a bit easier to tackle, and also something that's a bit closer to home. For anyone who doesn't know, I'm not Welsh, but I live in South Wales and I have done for over a decade now. And I've always been intrigued to learn more about the mythology of Britain, but also specifically of Wales. Recently, I picked up a copy of the Mabinogion. This edition is translated by Sioned Davies. And I've always been intrigued to learn more about Welsh myth and folklore, given that I live in Wales. And so I decided to set myself a personal curriculum of sorts based on learning more about Welsh mythology. I'm going to take you through in this video a couple of the books that I'm going to be using throughout this kind of learning experience, which I'm going to vlog for you, and a couple of the films that I'm looking to watch as well to kind of immerse myself in this topic. Starting with the Mabinogion. This is a collection of 11 tales from hundreds and hundreds of years ago. I've never attempted to read it. I didn't grow up in Wales, so I'm not really familiar with a lot of the stories from this, so this will be my first time kind of diving into some of these myths. And it's a lot slimmer, as you can see, compared to something like The Odyssey. But I also have a few other reference books of sorts, or collections, like modern retellings of myths as well. So I'm going to show you a couple that I have from my shelves, and we're also going to talk about some of the fiction books that I'm going to read that take their inspiration from Welsh mythology. Some of the collections I have Enchanted Wales, Myth and Magic in Welsh Storytelling by Miranda, Aldhouse-Green. Welsh Fairy Tales, Myths and Legends by Claire Fayers. This one isn't specific to Welsh folklore, but a lot of Welsh folklore will be featured in here. So hopefully if I pick this up, I will recognise some of the other stories that I'm going to come across in the other books that I'm hoping to get to as well. And this edition is like beautifully illustrated as well, so that'll make it a nice reading experience. Some of my most anticipated releases for 2026, funnily enough, take their inspiration from Welsh myth and folklore. The first of those I've managed to pick up from the library, and that is The Hill in the Dark Grove by Liam Higginson, who is an author from North Wales. This is his debut novel, and this tells the story of two sheep farmers in North Wales who are kind of down on their luck, struggling to get by and make a living off their land. The husband finds a buried prehistoric ruin on their land and becomes increasingly obsessed and entranced by this ruin, and his wife starts to find that she no longer recognizes her husband, and as winter is creeping in, she is increasingly isolated with a husband that she is increasingly recognizing less and less, and this looming ruin that they've discovered on the land. So this sounds like it's going to be very horror tinged, which I enjoy a lot. If I'm honest, some of the mythological adaptations that I've enjoyed most have a bit of a horror tinge to them, so I'm quite excited to get into this one. Another book which has just come out at the start of this month is Honeysuckle by Bar Fridman-Tell, who I believe is a Canadian author, but was inspired by the myth of Blodeuwedd for this story. Blodeuwedd was a woman made of flowers, and this takes that story and retells it, and I think it also draws some inspiration from like Frankenstein as well. So this is another one that kind of goes down the horror route, so I'm excited to pick that one up. I don't think my library has a copy yet, as it is such a new release, so I may end up treating myself to a copy of that. And then another book that I have acquired from the library, I've got an audio, and that is Salka by Francesca. And this is a retelling of the Lady in the Lake myth, which is one that I have read before and I am more familiar with. I believe the myth is based around a woman who comes out of the lake, marries a human man, and warns him that if he strikes her 3 times, she will return to the lake forever. And it's a very, very short one. I think the audiobook's only 3 hours long, but I really enjoy that myth, so I'm excited to see what Francesca has done with that in a modern retelling of it. Those are the books that I have to be getting on with. Some sort of translated original source material, some direct collections of retellings of the myths, and some fiction that draws heavily in its inspiration from those mythological stories. I've also, in my research, come across some films that I'm really hoping to get to over the coming weeks as well. I don't think this film is particularly popular, but one of my favourite films growing up was an animated film called The Black Cauldron, and I didn't realise this, but The Black Cauldron is directly inspired by the Mabinogion. It is inspired by a series of high fantasy novels that were written, I think, in the 80s, that were inspired directly by the Mabinogion. So I'm really excited to read this and then do a rewatch of The Black Cauldron and see if I can pick out the parallels between the two. I've always loved that film. Again, whenever I've enjoyed Disney films or animated films as a kid, I always liked the ones with a darker undertone. Like, my favourite Disney film is The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which I think is an incredibly dark kids film. And The Black Cauldron is another one where there was a lot of horror and kind of gothic-esque elements. I'm really excited to do a rewatch of that one. Some more modern films I've come across in my research are The Green Knight, and this is a retelling of the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is more of an Arthurian legend. I think it's a 14th century epic poem about Sir Gawain, but I think that figure draws heavily on inspiration from a Welsh background. So I've seen people say that there are connections between that story and the film, so I'm curious to check that out. And it stars Dev Patel, who is an incredible actor, and I'm always keen to see what he's been up to. Another film I found, funnily enough, starring Dev Patel, is more of a horror again. This one is called Rabbit Trap. It was produced by a Welsh production company based in Anglesey and filmed in large part in North Wales, which is really cool. But it's about this couple who move from London to North Wales to kind of focus on producing an album. And the husband, played by Dev Patel, goes out into the woods a lot to get recordings of like nature sounds to feature on the album. And in doing so, unwittingly brings some kind of malevolent presence into their home. So that sounds very cool and very eerie. Like I said, I love when myth is used in a more horror setting, so that's what I'm really excited to check out. And then another horror, also based on the myth of Blodeuwedd, is The Feast, which is a Welsh language film. I don't think I've seen any Welsh language films, so that's what I really hope I can get my hands on. Hello! Wednesday agrees. This is, again, a modern setting, but apparently draws very much from that myth, and is more of an ecological horror and an environmental horror, which always intrigues me. It follows a family who are throwing a dinner party. They, I believe, employ a woman to help them host this dinner party, and then some bad stuff goes down. I don't like to know too much about movies going into them, so I have kept my reading about it fairly brief, but I'm really intrigued about the fact that it's a Welsh language film and it's an all Welsh cast, so I'm really hoping that I can get my hands on that to check that one out as well, especially because it'll directly tie to Honeysuckle. I'd love to be able to see how different storytellers have taken that original myth and what they've done to take it in different directions. So that's just a little rapid fire introduction into some of the things that I'm going to be reading over the next couple of weeks. My plan is to start with the Mabinogion, maybe refer to some of these other books for a more simplified version of the stories if I'm finding the language difficult to get on with, or maybe just to see how they've been told in a modern way, and then pick up some of this fiction that's inspired by those stories as well, and see what different people have done with the myth and how they've interpreted them in a modern way. I hope you'll stick around and see how my reading and watching gets on. I'll update you as and when I've read or watched something and let you know my thoughts on it. I've seen some people who take their personal curriculum quite seriously and make it quite structured. For me, as soon as I add too much structure to a thing, I completely derail it. I'm very much a mood reader, and while I'm feeling very inspired by the books I've picked up, the films that I've found in my research, and I definitely want to dive headfirst into that, if I set myself specific goals about when I have to finish things or anything in particular like that, then I think the whole thing would probably fall apart and I would lose interest immediately. So I'm going to keep this fairly fluid and see how we go. This is my first time setting myself a personal curriculum of sorts, but I do love reading and researching and watching content around a specific topic or a specific theme. I think if I do that, my interest shouldn't wane and I should be able to maintain this level of excitement and motivation going forward. Not setting myself any specific deadlines. This is just what I've got happening at the minute. That's my plan for the next few weeks or so. So I hope you'll stick around and I will keep you updated about how I'm getting on. I have a little bit of a reading update for you. Haven't done a ton of reading so far. I've been kind of taking my time getting through the Mabinogion, and I've read what is referred to as the 4 branches of the Mabinogion. So that's the first 4 stories within the collection. Sorry if you can hear any like banging in the background, my husband's cooking. I already had some familiarity with some of them. I read this collection of stories a little while ago. This is just a random illustrated collection that I found, I think in Hay on Wye and maybe in the cinema bookshop. But it is just this quite lovely and quaint illustrated collection. In fact, I think this might be the story of the Lady of the Lake. Some of those illustrations are in colour. I may have a flick back through it actually to refamiliarise myself with the myths that this covers and some of the illustrations from in here. But because I had already read that, I was recognising beats as I was reading the first 4 branches of the Mabinogion. I enjoyed that I had some familiarity with the stories already and they weren't completely new and alien to me, but it has been nice to read them in, I guess, a more adult format, I suppose, because I think this collection is for children. So far, I think the women of the stories are what has interested me the most, or perhaps frustrated me the most, is the treatment of women and the discussion of women, which I think is probably quite a common theme in a lot of older texts and mythologies. You see a lot of, particularly the Greek pantheon of mythology, being rewritten from a feminist lens in the 21st century, and I think that has probably influenced me going into this. I'm finding the women the most interesting characters and also the most understood and the most villainized characters, particularly in the 4th branch of the Mabinogi, which is what has frustrated me the most, and that is the story where we are introduced to Gwledd, which is a story that is covered in here, so I did have some familiarity with it. All of the women, I think, in that story in particular are kind of treated as villainous, when from my perspective, I think it's very much the men of that tale that are the villains of the piece. For some context there, Blodeuwedd in particular is a woman who is made out of flowers for this man who is cursed by his mother. The curse is that he can never marry a human woman. So he and this like trickster magician character, they make this woman out of flowers, and she is built to be his wife, basically. That's her only role. That is the reason, that is her reason for being brought into the world, is to marry this man that she gets no say in. She ends up falling in love with another man and conspiring with that man to kill Llw, her husband, and he ultimately ends up betraying her also. And her tale is a very interesting one in that it talks a lot about freedom. She's punished at the end of the tale by being turned into an owl. I read a very interesting article by Theodora Goss, who I believe is the author of The Strange Case of the Alchemist's Daughter, that series of books. I've never read them though. I've never read anything by Theodora Goss, but I really enjoyed this article that I found from her, where she kind of talks about the maligned women of the Mabinogi and about Blodeuwedd in particular. And her perspective on it was that in being turned into an owl, Gwydion, the magician or wizard character, who he's kind of got some parallels to like Loki, I suppose. He's much more of a kind of trickster character, and he plays a lot of tricks on the other characters within this story. He turns her into an owl, saying that she's going to be reviled by all of the other birds. But Theodora Goss's take on it is very much that she is finally free in becoming an owl. She's no longer tethered to a man. She is given the gift of flight and able to just, you know, take off. So I thought that was quite an interesting perspective, and one that I quite enjoyed hearing, that reframing of the story of Blodeuwedd. There are other women in the story so far, like Branwen is a very interesting character, who is kind of almost like a Helen of Troy type of situation, in that her marriage to a man ends up leading to war between Wales and Ireland, not because she runs off with the King of Ireland, because it is agreed that they will marry, but then he treats her very badly once they return to Ireland, and so her brother, the giant Bran, comes to seek his vengeance essentially and save his sister from this maltreatment. And she kind of feels like a very calm and grounded presence in this story, surrounded by these very quick to act, quick to anger, quick to retribution male characters. And so far it's really been the women that I've been enjoying reading about. I did end up buying myself a copy of Honeysuckle by Bar Fridman-Tell. I had some national book tokens that I needed to use, so I thought, why not? Especially because I have found her to be such an interesting character in my reading of the Mabinogion. In this story, you are following, again, a girl or a woman who is made out of flowers, but she is made in the context of being a playmate for a boy made by his sister. So I'm not sure if there's going to become some kind of toxic romantic undertones there, or whether the story's going to go in a different direction, but I'm really excited to pick this one up and see. I've also listened to a really enjoyable podcast episode from History Extra, which is an hour or so long and just is a nice sort of introduction into Welsh myth, some of the creatures from Welsh myth, and some of the locations that are famous in Greek myth and Welsh myth, and also some of the links to Arthurian legend as well, other sort of Celtic myths and how they link back, and Arthurian legend, that kind of thing. So that was a really nice listening experience for someone who isn't super familiar with Welsh mythology. The plan is to carry on and finish the rest of the stories in the Mabinogion, and then make a start on some of these retellings that I have compiled. I'm also going to be checking out some of the films that I spoke to you about in my introduction as well, but I think I promise my husband can cook. But my plan going forward is to carry on with the Mabinogion, finish all of these stories, and then carry on with my additional reading and have a look at the ways in which those myths have been reframed and retold from a modern lens, both in book form and also in some of the films that I spoke to you about before. So far I'm having a really good time. I feel like I'm learning a lot, and I feel like when I've engaged with mythological stories and folklore tales in the past, I haven't had a lot of background context and information about these tales. Made them feel a bit more disconnected from me perhaps, and I've never really taken the time to do more further research, but I'm really enjoying myself in reading around these stories and learning about them in a slightly more engaged context, I suppose, than I have in the past. I'll be back to update you. I'm probably going to try and just finish the Mabinogion before I speak to you next, and then maybe I'll have started on some of the retellings as well, maybe. Hi, it's been a little while since I updated you. I've been doing a lot of reading, a lot of watching, a lot of researching, and not a lot of talking to you about it, so I apologise. Before I get into everything that I've been reading and watching recently, I will address the elephant in the room. I have shaved all my hair off, yeah. I don't know if any of you can relate, but I've always found having hair to be kind of a sensory nightmare, and I would feel kind of paranoid and stressed out about my hair all the time. And I'm really lazy and I can't be bothered to do anything with my hair. I can't be bothered to style it. So what was the most low maintenance haircut I could possibly get? It was no hair. So that's what I've done. When I first shaved it, I did bleach it, and so it was like fully platinum, which I like. But it's growing back very fast. You can already see a lot of root, which I anticipated. So I am going to have to bleach it myself quite a lot, but I think it's going to be worth it because it's going to save me so much money. Since switching hairdressers, since going vegan, like the cost of getting my hair done has gone through the roof, and I just can't be arsed. I just simply can't be arsed with it. I have a lot to update you on, so I'm going to try and get through things relatively speedily and not ramble too much. I have finished the Mabinogion. I think the last time I spoke to you I had read the 4 branches. I've now read the other 7 stories in this. I have to say they did get a bit repetitive. There is a kind of overarching theme of knights going out, questing, doing some stuff, fighting over women, fighting over objects, fighting over honour. It's very sausage festy, I have to say. As someone who's been reading the Mabinogion with more of a feminist lens and wanting to see more of the women in it, the women become much fewer and far between in the later stories, and they're already pretty scarce in the first few branches of the Mabinogion, so it definitely didn't appeal to my sensibilities as much reading the second half or so of the book. Having said that, there were a lot of interesting themes throughout the Mabinogion that I found enjoyable to read about. There's a lot of shape-shifting and magic and changing of one's form, which is really interesting. This is particularly interesting in the 4th branch again, which I think I have to say is my favourite story from the Mabinogion. I think it's the richest in terms of its thematic elements, its characterizations, its exploration of good versus evil. It is one of the darker stories as well, though, I have to say. Potential trigger warning for some of the discussions of the 4th branch in particular. It does feature very dubious consent and also a sexual assault of a character, like canonically a sexual assault of a character, as well as some other questionable actions and issues of consent that we will discuss a little bit. So if you don't really want to hear about that, like, feel free to absolutely skip ahead or skip off the video. The 4th branch is very rich in its duality between good and evil and its grey areas, and yeah, it's just a very interesting and rich story thematically compared to some of the other ones, which started to get a bit repetitive for me as I was reading. The shapeshifting in the 4th branch is very interesting in particular because you have Gawain, who is a virgin who kind of belongs, I suppose, to Math, who for whatever reason is cursed that he has to always have his feet in the lap of a virgin unless he is at war. So Gawain is very, very important to him, but a character called Gylfaethwy I don't know how to pronounce that name. That name. I've been practicing the pronunciation of a lot of the names in here, but that one in particular, like, just scrambles my brain a little bit. Basically, this character, Mabinogion, who I think I discussed before, features it heavily in the story of Blodeuwedd. They conspire because Gwledd wants to rape Gerwin. He's sexually attracted to her, he wants her for himself, and so they conspire to get Math away at war so that the rape of Gerwin can occur. And when it does, and they are punished by Math, he punishes them in a way that they deserve to be punished, obviously, don't get me wrong. But the punishment that is chosen is particularly interesting because these two characters are forced to shapeshift into animals, 3 different animals, I think stag and doe, boar and wolf. I can't remember off the top of my head which 3 animals, but they have to shapeshift into a male and female pair of these 3 animals, and they cannot come back to Math until they have conceived offspring. So not only is there animal human shapeshifting happening, but there's also like gender fluidity stuff happening and incesty stuff happening, which is pretty intense. But I found it to be very interesting that such an ancient story plays around with gender in such a way that you have these canonically male characters being shapeshifted into female animals, but also the fact that that's being done in the sense of a punishment is very interesting as well. There are also lots of interesting references to the otherworld. The first branch of the Mabinogion is an obvious example of this. The main character, Pwyll, he goes to Anun or Anavan, I've seen it spelt both ways, and takes the place of King Arawn for a year in order to fight a battle for him that he has not been able to win against a rival king. But the otherworld is a very interesting concept in Welsh myth because it doesn't really tie into death. It's not an afterlife or a place for the dead. It's very much just a non-human realm. It is the realm where magic exists, where magical creatures live, and the boundary between the two seems to become quite thin, and you have these mystical characters kind of dipping in and out of the human world at their will. And human characters, as in the first branch with Pwyll, can travel into the other world as well. So there seems to be a very thin kind of veil between the two. I actually attended a talk recently, which was very interestingly and well timed. It was run by Seed Talks, and it's about the history of folk horror. And so not necessarily directly tied into mythology, but there's some links, I would say, between the two subjects, and particularly in their relation to rural folk belief and magic and all things like that. And when I was at this talk, the speaker, Professor Linton, I think her name was, mentioned witch trials throughout the course of the lecture, and she spoke about a fact that I wasn't aware of previously, that there were many witch trials and many convicted witches and many killings that happened in England and Scotland. Not very many in Wales at all, and I went and researched it afterwards. There were only 5 people that historically we know have been convicted of witchcraft and executed in Wales. And the way Professor Linton described that phenomenon is she seems to believe that it was very heavily tied to Welsh people's relationship to their folk belief and their mythology and their relationship to magic. A lot of Welsh people would rely on these kind of witchy women or like medicine women of sorts that would know herbal remedies and would treat people. But it also gave an interesting additional context to the idea of this other world and how closely it links and how closely it resides to the human realm. And this idea that Welsh people have historically had a closer tie to the magic in their stories and a closer sense of that. I mean, there's so many stories in other collections, and we'll come to this one in a little bit, talk about fairies and people falling into fairy realms and fairies coming and taking human children or marrying humans. And so there seems to be this kind of connection to magic within Welsh rural life that perhaps there hasn't been so much within other parts of the UK and other parts of Europe, which meant that the witch trials could be much more successful. There are other aspects to it as well. I did a little bit of reading around it, and the prevalence of Welsh language was another one. The fact that a lot of the trials like didn't have the same weight to them necessarily because there was that language barrier between Welsh and English, which meant that the trials weren't necessarily taken as seriously perhaps, and they were more difficult to try because of the language barrier. So it's obviously not the only reason, but it's an interesting theory, and it's interesting to think that perhaps historically in Wales people have felt a more personal connection to their myth in that way, and I really enjoyed learning that. I found that lecture to actually be very beneficial as well when watching some of the films that I've been watching, which I'll update you on in a little bit as well, to be able to recognise some of the common motifs and see how myth and horror kind of come together to create a lot of the media that I'm familiar with or that I'm learning about for this video. Anyway, getting back on track, once I finished the Mabinogion, I then picked up this little collection. This does touch on some of the stories that I'd already read in the Mabinogion, but it also features others that don't feature in that collection, particularly around the Tylwyth Teg, which are the fair folk, so fairies in Welsh mythology, which, as I've said, are these kind of more nefarious characters a lot of the time. There are lots of stories about fair folk stealing children, about the fair folk getting revenge on humans for perceived slights. Like, there's a story in here about a mining town where the mine runs dry after a child forgets to leave out an offering or declines to leave out an offering to try and prove that the fair folk aren't real, and then it leads to consequences for the people that forget those offerings or decline to give them. There are other stories that I've come across as well about people being brought into the fairy realm for periods of time, and then for some people that like the period of time feels a lot longer in the human realm, and they come back and like their relatives are no longer around and things like that. So the fair folk are not necessarily evil beings, but definitely morally grey, not very sort of cut and dry black and white characters in Welsh mythology. There are other creatures that you learn about in here. A classic myth that I was already familiar with is the story of Gwledd, who is a dog that is slayed by his owner, thinking that the dog has killed his baby son, only to discover the body of a wolf later in the room and realise that Gwledd has actually defended the baby, who is found alive and well, against this wolf. There's also tales in here about dragons, obviously, like if you're familiar with the Welsh flag, it's got a big old dragon on it, and the myth about why that is, and about the dueling dragons sort of hidden within the earth. That's talked about in here as well. So this is a lot more diverse of a collection than this is. It takes the Mabinogion as a source material, but other collections of myth and folktale as well. I will say about this one, it's very simplified. It's very accessible for that reason. I think this would be a great one for younger people who are looking to learn more about fairy tales and myths. And I believe there is a wider collection as well about like Irish myth, Scottish myth, etc. in this edition. I definitely think it would appeal to a younger audience as opposed to an adult audience, or for people who are becoming familiar with these folktales for the first time. I think they're very accessibly written, but they are also very basic, and there is a lot of nuance that is glossed over within these stories. Particularly, to my chagrin, the story of Blodeuwedd is very simplified in here, and she's very much cut and dry the villain. And if there's an overarching theme to this vlog, it's me wanting to vindicate Blodeuwedd, because I think she is very, very misunderstood, and I think that she is not a perfect person. Obviously, like, aspiring to kill your husband is not ideal, but I think given the circumstances, maybe we should give her a little bit more grace. But yeah, there's a lot of simplification of these stories, a lot of nuance is gone, a lot of creative liberties, shall we say, in simplifying the stories down to make them very palatable, very accessible. It was a nice resource to have, but it's definitely very much an entry point or a good collection for someone who is younger and getting into reading myth for the first time. This book, which I spoke about in my introduction to the vlog, is not a collection of retellings as such. It's more of an analysis of the stories, a look at the themes. Like if I show you the contents, it goes through a lot of the themes. So gods and heroes, other worlds and immortality, goddesses, witches and shamed women, capricious cauldrons. So it does tell you a little bit about the myths, but it doesn't straight up rewrite them in the way that this does. It gives you an idea of what stories feature those motifs, and then it gives you some wider context. It touches on archaeology from the time. It talks a lot about Irish myth, interestingly, and the parallels between Welsh and Irish myth, which I guess makes sense because Ireland does actually feature in the Mabinogion, and in the second branch there is a huge devastating war between Wales and Ireland, so it makes sense that there would be some kind of crossover in their myths, but she talks about that in a lot more detail in here. And so this has been a really nice reference point to have alongside my research, because I'm able to pick out themes and motifs from the original source material or the translated source material, and then read more about what those mean, the relevance for people's lives at the time, archaeological evidence that supports things like that. Something I found really interesting, I don't know if anyone's been to the Roman baths in Bath, but if you have, I'm pretty sure it was there I saw for the first time these little like curse tablets, which are like metal or stone tablets that people literally wrote curses on, and then like to appeal to the gods, I suppose, to curse people. And curses feature quite heavily in some of the stories in the Mabinogion. Again, in the fourth branch in particular, the reason that Blodeuwedd is created is because Llw has been cursed and he can never marry a human woman. Similarly, earlier in the story, Gylfaethwy and Gwydion are cursed to take the form of animals. So there's lots of cursing happening, and it talked about the archaeological evidence of those curse tablets, and so that was very interesting. It talks a lot about cauldrons as well, which makes sense. There's a few stories about cauldrons, particularly again in the second branch you have the cauldron of rebirth. That is a big part of the story, and a big element within the war between Wales and Ireland. This has been a good entry point into learning more about the myths on a thematic level rather than just reading them at surface level. I'm not finished with this one yet. I am most of the way through. I have mixed feelings about the author's take on women in the Mabinogion. Again, she kind of paints Blodeuwedd and also Llw's mother Aranrhod as very straight up villainous characters and villainous women. She gives a lot more grace to Rhiannon and Branwen, and talks about them more favourably, but she also at certain points kind of glosses over some of the violence that happens towards women. I can't find the exact page it was on now, but I think her first mention, or one of her early mentions of Gawain, is to talk about her being seduced and defiled, which I thought was a very interesting choice of words, given that she is not seduced. Being seduced suggests that she consented to what happened, which she absolutely did not, and she does correct herself later in the book and refer to it as an assault, which is what it was. But I thought that was an interesting way to talk about this incident of violence for the first time early on in your book. To suggest some kind of moral failing on the part of the victim, I thought was a bit of an icky choice. She does have a chapter later on, I think I mentioned it, goddesses, witches and shamed women. So she does talk about the misogyny that is inherent in the Mabinogion, and I think, to be honest, given the society we live in, we live under patriarchy and we have for thousands of years, I don't think this is a unique theme for Welsh mythology by any means. I think You just have to look around at the plethora of feminist Greek myth retellings that we have to recognise there is a problem with misogyny in a lot of old tales that we still talk about today. So I did appreciate that she addressed that, but like I said, she very much talks about Rhiannon and Branwen and other women in the Mabinogion. She doesn't seem to have as much forgiveness for. So I can't say I agree with her on everything that she's talked about, but some of the other stuff that I have no background in and have no way of forming an opinion on has been useful to read about and to be able to have a bit more in-depth understanding of the Mabinogion. That's it in terms of like source material stuff. I decided to forego reading Celtic Tales for now. I still want to come back to this at some point. It's such a gorgeous, gorgeous edition. But as I was flipping through it, I realised it told you the origin of each story. And only one of these was Welsh. And they were very much mostly Irish, I think. So I think I'm going to save this and maybe come back and do another kind of personal curriculum sort of thing on other Celtic myth, Arthurian myth, Irish myth. I think that would be a fun thing to do in the future. So I'm going to save this for that. And to be honest, I've gotten a bit bored of just like reading retellings, like brief kind of retellings, illustrated retellings of collections of myths. I'm much more in the mood now for a story to take one particular myth or one particular tale and really run with that. So that brings us on to Salka, which is the first like retelling of sorts, like in-depth retelling that I've read for this video. And unfortunately, I was not a fan of this one. So to give you some context for Salka, it's a retelling of the story of the Lady of the Lake being Llyn Van Fach. This story is of a fairy from the Tylwyth Teg, and in this story she's named Salka. I think in other stories she's unnamed, sometimes she is named. There's lots of variations on this particular story, but the bare bones of it is she is a fairy from the lake. Interestingly, a lot of stories around the fair folk focus on water, and a lot of time they live in water or around lakes or within lakes. In the story, she falls in love with a farmer, human farmer. She comes out of the lake to be with him, and in some stories it's her, in some stories it's her father. Tell the farmer, like, we can marry, and I'll bring with me this like wonderful dowry of like loads of magical livestock, but if you strike me 3 times I will return to the lake forever. And inevitably the husband does end up striking her 3 times. In some of the stories this is accidental, like he'll throw something to her and she won't catch it and it'll hit her arm, and that's a strike. In other stories it is straight up instances of domestic violence. So it depends on the version of the story that you're reading, really. In this version they are what is referred to as heart blows, which just seems to be any time that Owain the farmer makes her sad. Anytime he makes her sad by being like, can you act a little bit differently around the villagers we live with who are very suspicious of you, she's like, you've struck me a heart blow. I think it's supposed to be making some kind of commentary on otherness and acceptance and isolated communities, but I just don't think it did it very successfully. This is a very kind of cut and paste retelling. Not a lot of originality is injected into the story. It's very much just being told as it has always kind of been told, with a couple of exceptions that I don't think were very successful. The chapters are very short and they're very much from the first person perspective of whichever character is speaking at that time, and the villagers of Myddfai, which is where the farm is, have speaking parts in the story, and a lot of them were just very surface level, didn't add, like particularly Nevin, who is the woman who has always believed that she is going to grow up to marry Owain so that their family farms can be combined, and she is just really, really bitter about the fact that Owain has married someone else, and all of her chapters are basically just calling Salka a bitch and talking about how much she hates her. And so her characterization was very, very one note, kind of tied into misogynistic tropes of like the jilted woman who didn't get her man. And that was really boring and annoying to read. I hated every time a Nevin chapter happened. Or you have other villagers who are like, I'm very suspicious of that Salka. She doesn't act very normal. Why doesn't she like to wear shoes? Or the men being very accepting of Salka because she's hot and they think she's really like beautiful and physically attractive. So they're like, go on, Owain, well done. And all of the women are like, she's very different from us and she doesn't really get on with us. There is one character who I immediately read as queer. There's a female character who's very taken with and forms a friendship with Salka. And I was like, this is very sapphic coded. And then it did become sapphic in that wasn't Angharad, it was something else beginning with an A, but I can't remember her name now, admits in her internal monologue that she has feelings for Salka, and Salka acknowledges that she is aware of it, and the fact that she has never married because she is not attracted to men, but promises her that her secret is safe with her. And I love injecting a queer aspect into myth retellings and stories, but this just added nothing. Like, there was no reason for this girl to be queer. The sapphic element didn't go anywhere. I guess you could say it kind of made a commentary on othering and these two characters who are kind of treated with suspicion being brought together, but the sapphic character isn't really treated with suspicion. Like, nobody really talks about her and nobody like suspects her of being queer, so it didn't really have the emotional depth that I would have liked it to, which is a big shame. And yeah, I just found the writing to be incredibly surface level, the characterization to be very surface level. It was just very mid. It didn't add any kind of commentary on the myth or add anything, any kind of new perspective on it. It didn't even have any potency as like a story of domestic abuse and escaping from that, because there isn't really abuse in the same way that there is in some of the other retellings of the story or versions of the story where she is physically hit by the farmer, in this instance called Owain. In this instance, he literally, like, she's laughing at a baby's funeral and he's like, Salka, can you stop it? Like, everyone's staring at you, you're laughing, and the family are over here grieving. And she's just like, well, I'm a fairy and I can see that the baby is happy in the other world now, so why shouldn't I laugh and be merry? And you've struck me the final heart blow. And I'm just like, I don't think it's that unreasonable to ask your wife to stop laughing at a baby's funeral, even if she is a fairy. Like, I don't know, like, it didn't have any emotional punch, like, of being a story of, you know, young first love turning toxic and sour. It was just, yeah, flimsy. It was just a very flimsy retelling, and it didn't really feel like it had any reason to exist, to be honest. So that one was a shame, but I haven't let it put me off. I'm still on a mission to find myth retellings that I enjoy. I have started The Hill in the Dark Grove by Liam Higginson. I'm about 50 pages in, just shy of 50 pages. And so far, it's very eerie. It's really successfully capturing the sense of rural isolation even before we haven't gotten to the part where they discover this ruin yet. It's been focusing a lot more on building a setting and building up an idea of a history of isolation and what that community looks like. There's also these interesting parts that kind of go back in time to, I guess, after the First or Second World War. I'm not 100% clear on this yet, but there are these kind of historical parts that are adding a lot of foreboding to the story. So I'm really enjoying the atmosphere of this one so far, but not very far through it yet. I will let you know when I've read a bit more of that one. In terms of the films, I have done my rewatch of the Black Cauldron, and as I suspected, it doesn't really hold up watching it as an adult, unfortunately. I was able to see kind of the inconsistencies in the animation. Like, the animation really isn't anything special or very visually exciting. At times you can kind of get this rushed sense that it wasn't that maybe it faced some problems in production because the animation looks really off in parts. and it really reads very flat at times. I enjoyed the overall aesthetic of like the gothic castle and the forest scenes, how quickly they went from idyllic to very sinister. Like, I think aesthetically there was something there, but it just wasn't like successfully pulled off. The writing of it isn't particularly great either. Like, it's fine, but it's definitely not holding up like some of my other childhood favourites. But it was really fun to re-watch it and be able to see the elements that were pulled from Welsh myth. The obvious inspiration is the Cauldron of Rebirth from the second branch, which I talked about. This is a cauldron that is used by the King of Ireland. He can put dead soldiers into it and they will rise again, but they will be mute, they will be unable to speak. And so he's able to use this Cauldron of Rebirth to help in like the war effort. In the Black Cauldron you have the villain who is the Horned King, and he is hunting for the Black Cauldron because it can do the same thing, whereby he has amassed this collection of corpses that he wants to put into the cauldron. But his motivations are a bit flimsy. You don't really understand why he wants to do this beyond just being like this evil demon looking guy. But the actual cauldron itself is interesting, and the fact that the cauldron could be destroyed in the same way as it was in the second branch. So in it you have Efnisien, who has been kind of an ass this whole time. A lot of the things that have gone down between Wales and Ireland are like directly his fault, and he has also like killed a child. He decides to redeem himself by jumping into the cauldron, at which point I think his heart bursts and the cauldron kind of explodes and is destroyed. And a similar thing happens in the Black Cauldron. A character has to sacrifice themselves by willingly jumping into the cauldron in order to it doesn't become physically destroyed, but the evil within it is destroyed. So I knew going into it that the Cauldron of Rebirth was obviously going to be a big theme within the story, but something that I had forgotten that was a part of the story as well is that you do meet the fair folk, and you do meet them because the characters fall into a lake and the fair folk live within it. And I thought that was a really fun nod to Welsh myth as well. Another element that I enjoyed from that film was the character of Feluda, who is a bard. I really thought it was a smart choice to have a bard character be a part of this story. I wish he was a little bit better developed, but it made sense to have him there as this nod to the oral storytelling tradition that gave us source references like the Mabinogion. Like, these stories would have been told and handed down through the ages until they were finally written down. And so without that tradition of oral storytelling, we wouldn't have these myths having survived as long as they have. So I liked that they had a bard in there. I thought that was a smart choice. I've watched one other film in my quest, and this is the last thing I have to talk about because I've been chatting to you for ages now. But I have watched Rabbit Trap, which is the Dev Patel horror film set in North Wales. This one is a very, very interesting film. It's very twisty and it doesn't give you very many clear answers. I watched it with my husband, and if you're somebody who likes a film to really like tell you what it's about and wrap things up in a neat bow and give you answers, you're not going to like this film very much at all. We were getting to the end of the film and Ryan was literally Googling like, what Welsh myth is this? Because he was like, I'm so confused at what story this is meant to be. And it isn't really a direct retelling of any story. It's more of an exploration of the Tylwyth Teg and what they mean in different mythologies and at different stories within Welsh myth. It's very visually stunning film. It's shot in North Wales, which is just one of the most beautiful places on earth, I think. Like, when you first sort of get up to North Wales and the mountains start changing, it's a very different atmosphere from South Wales, actually. Like, we've got mountains down here, but they've got mountains up there, and it feels like you're on a different planet. It's really, really incredible. So the landscape is beautiful. The sound is incredible. This film focuses on this couple who've come to North Wales to work on an album, and the husband goes out to record nature sounds to use on the album. And so sound is a huge part of the story. and sound is really effectively used in the story. Dev Patel's character, in doing this and recording these sounds from nature, he inadvertently awakens some kind of malevolent spirit. Or is it malevolent? There's an argument to be made there, and it becomes determined to kind of infiltrate their home. It presents as this very young teenager who kind of becomes obsessed with them, and it takes some very like twisted turns. It was ultimately like more of a meditation on trauma and family, which I thought was really interesting because, as I said previously, some of the stories of the fair folk focus on kidnapping children, and I feel like I've read this in the past, that like families kind of believed that if your child had been swapped for a fairy child, you had to like drown it to get your child back. I do wonder if violence was done to children in the name of not believing this child was your own. You can imagine that like the first sign of a presentation of a disability or a neurological difference, you know, rumours would abound that the fair folk had gotten somebody's child, and the violence that may have been done as a result of that. And so I thought that was a really, really interesting take on the Tylwyth Teg. And the film was incredibly ominous, but the ending wasn't horrific. It really took a like kind of hopeful turn at the end, which was really unexpected for a horror movie. It was really unique, really unlike a lot of things I've watched in the past. I did appreciate that I had previously attended that folk horror talk, because I was able to identify a lot of the themes that Marissa Linton was talking about. The sense of rural isolation, the outsider who is messing with things they shouldn't be is a really common theme in folk horror. Lots of ties to the landscape and local belief, the landscape and the dangers that are inherent in that landscape as well. So yeah, this was a fun one to watch after just having been to that talk, because I felt like I could pick out a lot more from the film, having learned all that kind of historical context around the development of folk horror as a genre. I'm really glad that I went to that lecture, and I definitely should go to more, because I do love sitting in on a lecture. If I could just go to uni just learn and learn and learn for the rest of my life, I absolutely would do it. That sounds like a dream. But that's where I am so far. I've done a lot of research, as I've said, a lot of reading, a lot of watching, so I hope some of that ramble was of interest to you and made a lick of sense. I'm making my way through The Hill in the Dark Grove. I have Honeysuckle next on my radar, and I'm definitely going to get to The Feast, which is the Welsh language film I talked about. I don't think I'm going to watch The Green Knight for this vlog. This vlog has kind of shown me that I would really like to do this with more mythologies. So I might try and get a copy of that myth, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and read it and then watch the adaptation, because I've really enjoyed doing this. So I think I'm going to leave that and the Celtic Tales book for another time. But that's where I'm at so far. I will come back and update you when I've done some more reading. So far, I'm enjoying The Hill in the Dark Grove, so I'm hoping this is going to be a lot more successful reading experience than Salka was. But I will come back when I've read some more and let you know. Good morning. I'm taking you on an adventure today. The fun thing about Welsh mythology is that so many of the stories are like tied to actual places, and a lot of those places are quite close to me. So we're gonna go to Llanfairpwll today, the setting for the story of the Lady of the Lake, the retelling Salka that I read earlier in this vlog. So I thought, why not visit a location from the myth that I've been reading, and why not take you along with me? So that's what we're doing today. As long as we can park, because we've had to leave a lot later than I would have liked, because I've been stuck in waiting for a delivery. So keep your fingers crossed for me that we can park, and then I will take you with me to Llanfairpwll, which I've wanted to visit for years and I've just never managed to get around to doing it. So this is a really nice excuse to finally tick that off the bucket list. have more updates. I have now watched The Feast and I have finished reading The Hill in the Dark Grove. I no longer have my copy of that to hand because I have finally taken it back to the library. All of the librarians at Swansea Central Library will be very relieved, I'm sure. I find that these two pieces of media in particular feel very much in conversation with one another, but I'm going to start by talking about The Feast. This is a very kind of low-budget indie horror film. It's entirely in the Welsh language with an all-Welsh cast, and it is very much a kind of ecological folk horror. The main premise of the film is that you have this very wealthy family who have torn down a local farm and erected this kind of modernist prison feeling like house, very expensive house in the middle of nowhere in North Wales. They are actively in talks with a mining company to dig and investigate on the property to see what resources may be in the land, and they host this dinner party to bring together the mining executive and a neighbouring farmer, and it's very much about sort of wealth extraction in terms of like class, but also resource extraction from the land. The family at the centre of the film very much sort of find ways to exhibit and wield their power over this woman, this local woman that they have hired to come and serve at the dinner party, and they are constantly sort of belittling her or looking down on her, but in very kind of subtle ways that are very, I would say, reflective of like class disparity. But you very quickly come to realise that Caddy is not all that she seems to be. She's very mysterious, very eerie, quite a creepy character. But she's also got this kind of innocence to her almost that makes you feel kind of tender towards her, even though she's doing some strange things. And things devolve from there. It's kind of very much a take on the idea of Blodeuwedd as a Mother Nature kind of figure getting revenge on the people that have taken advantage of her. When I was reading up about the film, I found this quote from the director that I really liked that I'll read to you. "This wizard harnessed the forces of nature and put her in a body of flesh and blood. But of course Blodeuwedd was very frustrated by that and decided to get her revenge. The character of Blodeuwedd is very definitely in the DNA of Caddy." So while this isn't a very direct sort of cut and paste retelling as some of the other things that I've read have been, I'm looking at you, Salka, the fabric of that story is very woven into the tale that's being told here and reframed in a modern context that explores the ideas of climate change resulting from wealth extraction of the land, but also how invading foreign powers come in to take things of value from the land, from people that live there, ignoring warnings from locals or the customs of locals. It very much had that folk horror flavour that I learned about at the lecture I spoke about before earlier in my video, where you have this outsider come in and naively do things in this landscape that they know little about or they don't fully understand. What was interesting about this is the characters are obviously all Welsh. The wife in the family, Glenda, I think her name was, she has inherited this farm. It's her family's farm, but she's kind of turned her back on this culture and this heritage that she has in order to align herself more closely with wealth. And in doing that, it's kind of about the sacrifices that she's made and the way that those will end up coming back to haunt her later on in the story. I like this a lot. If you are somebody who enjoys horror and you enjoy an ecological kind of horror, then this one is one I would definitely recommend to you. The one major criticism I had of it, and that meant that I didn't rate it a little bit higher, I think I gave it a 3.5 star on Letterboxd. There are some scenes at the beginning of the film where you're like, what's that about? What's the callback going to be to that later? Like, how does this play into the story? And you kind of, as the viewer, get a strong sense of what the outcome of those things is going to be. And then when the events unfolded as I was expecting them to, we got like flashback scenes that felt very unnecessary. And it almost felt like the director didn't have quite enough faith in you as the viewer to put two and two together and go, well, if this is what happened earlier on in the film, then the likely conclusion is that this event's going to happen. Like, they didn't have faith in you to put those things together on your own. And it does annoy me a little bit when films and even books do that, because it makes me feel like you're questioning my intelligence as a consumer of your project, your art, your work. So I want you to have a little bit more faith in me to be able to put these things together, especially because some of the things were incredibly obvious and they weren't exactly subtle in the way that they've been introduced earlier on. There's particularly something around the character of Gwledd, one of the brothers, and it's hinted at that he has some kind of nefarious, shady background, and it becomes very obvious what that is. Like, I remember my husband turning around to me and going, oh, it's going to be that he's done this. And then it turned out to be exactly what he had done. And you didn't really need the film to tell you that. The context clues are enough for you to put that information together in your head and go, okay, like this is why we don't like him. So I do feel like the ending would have been more satisfying for me if the director had not treated me like I was a bit dumb at the end and I wasn't going to get it. But the ending is definitely very memorable. It's very much a slow burn with lots of eerie, odd, unsettling things happening that all come together in this absolute crescendo that almost verges on camp at points. And some of the body horror, it feels very like over the top in a kind of almost campy way. But then the very last shot of the film is very, very affecting, and I won't tell you what it is in case you want to go and watch it for yourself. It's, again, very, very subtle, but it really takes this turn away from this kind of crazy ending that we've seen and like flips things for you as the audience. So I had a really good time watching The Feast, and I'm really glad that I've done this video and the way that it's brought me kind of back into my horror era a little bit. Like, I was quite a morbid teenager and I watched a lot of horror. I kind of was an avid reader for much of my childhood, and then when I hit my teen years I kind of stopped reading for pleasure so much, but I got really into horror films, and those two interests never really collided. I kind of just fell out of watching horror films and got back into reading as an adult. And it's nice to rediscover a love of horror and to revisit the genre, especially in film, but also a little bit in books as well. So The Hill in the Dark Grove is also a horror. As I said before, it feels very much in conversation with The Feast in that it talks a lot about this kind of almost rape of the Welsh land, I suppose, and the way English people in particular come in, buy up second homes, don't have an appreciation for the land. It talks a lot about tourists getting stranded in mountains and on hikes and things like that, and not having respect for the landscape. The way that farming communities kind of get decimated by selling off and buying up of portions of land for other resources or to make holiday homes or second homes, whatever that may be. And it talked about that quite a lot, and so there were a lot of parallels I felt between those two stories. But The Hill in the Dark Grove is much more a story about an internal struggle with that. In The Feast, you've got this outside force that is perpetrating all these events that go down in the film, whereas in The Hill in the Dark Grove, it feels very introspective. You have these two characters who are in old age. They're both in their 70s. They have no children. They are very much struggling to maintain their way of life. Their debts are racking up. They're trying to find a way to be able to preserve their home without having to sell off portions of their land. And they're also grappling with the fact that they are mortal and they're approaching the last years of their lives, and what memory looks like and what legacy looks like. So you have Carwyn, who is the husband, and he discovers this Neolithic monument on the land, and it really alters his mental state. But then you also have periods of the novel where you're questioning his wife Rhiann's mental state as well, and wondering, well, who is the one who is kind of losing it here. Is it both of them? Is it either of them? Is it a unseen force from the land? Is it an internal struggle? Like, and there are a lot of unanswered questions. This definitely isn't one to read if you like a tight-knit kind of plot that's wrapped up in a nice bow at the end and it doesn't leave you questioning, it gives you all the answers. If you like something that's very open-ended and can be interpreted in a lot of different ways, and you were going to get on with this one. It's very slow burn as well, like The Feast, and it doesn't really come to the same kind of gory crescendo. It still kind of maintains that mystery and that just ominous creeping sense of dread throughout, and when you get to the end you really find yourself questioning what even could have happened. This one is also drawing inspiration from a lot of different strands of mythology. I was really grateful that I read the Mabinogion before I read this, because there are so many references throughout that I think reading this as someone who didn't have that knowledge beforehand, maybe it doesn't matter because it does give you a lot of context clues and it does talk a lot about the myths and give you some semblance of the stories. So maybe it wouldn't have impacted my reading experience of it. But I did feel a little bit of a connection, a deeper connection perhaps to the book, because I recognised the stories that it was so referential to, and because I understood these snippets that were being placed throughout the book. It really does weave mythology and history and stories of the land into the lives of these two characters. It's not a linear narrative. You have the characters reflecting back on their childhoods, around how they met as teenagers again, and how they came together and ended up becoming a couple. It reflects on their lives together, how they were unable to have any children. And as I said, because they are in old age, they are grappling with this idea of like, what is it that I'm going to leave behind? And this is something that plays a huge part in the novel and is something that is referenced a lot, and you see the characters juggling with it and kind of coming to two very different outcomes. I want to read you some of the quotes that I enjoyed from the book to kind of give you a bit of a flavour of the writing style. Things used to be better when there had been local gods who occupied themselves with no more than a single valley or a mountain or a lake, for a god who ruled alone over the universe could hardly be expected to attend to so remote a place as this. What did it matter if she died today and left no grand and glorious legacy when she was gone? Her life had mattered to her, and it had mattered to the people to whom she mattered in turn. That was her monument. She did not need it told in myth or built in stone. It was a landscape where one might meet gods. There's lots of references to gods, religion, mythology. There are also these interesting passages throughout that are just kind of snippets of different aspects of history that have occurred in the North Welsh valleys. None of them really tie up into any kind of second timeline narrative by any means. They give a sense of just like the turmoil that has occurred on the land and the different kind of historical eras and the different conflicts and the ways that different people would have lived and how those different people approached death, how those people interpreted myth, how they developed over time. It's kind of an interesting little aspect of the novel that doesn't add anything necessarily in terms of plot to the narrative. You don't uncover some kind of secret about where this monument has come from, but you just get this ongoing sense of a history that has been going on for thousands of years and will continue to go on after these two characters pass away. And it's a very interesting novel. It felt very unique. I don't feel like I've read a lot of things like this, and I did definitely have a really good time reading it. Some of the passages in it are pretty gross if you're not somebody who has been around animal death, and if you've seen the name of my channel, you may not obviously want to read about animal death. I would understand that, but given the nature of the lives of these two main characters, they are sheep farmers, and sheep are pretty delicate creatures, and they do die, and they get disease that is deeply unpleasant. They get attacked by birds, and especially like during lambing season and stuff. It's pretty grim, but the way that it's written, it's not sensationalized. You really get the sense that this is just like the everyday of these characters' lives. But I can understand that if you're someone who hasn't had a lot of experience of that, then it would be quite off-putting and horrible to read. But I didn't have that experience. Like, I was able to say objectively, like, this is a gross thing, but it made perfect sense in the context of these characters' lives and the brutality of farming, rural farming life. So I thought that was very well done. There wasn't an over-the-topness to these scenes. They were treated with the gravity they deserved, while also making you get the sense that this is just a part of life, and you were able to kind of tell when these things sort of turned away from the norm for the characters, and when perhaps something is a bit more extreme than it would be normally, or perhaps this isn't quite how you would expect things to go, and the things that make the characters become wary of what's maybe going on around them. So definitely, like, tread with caution if you're somebody that can't handle like animal gore and animal death. Like, that's possibly the big trigger warning for this book. That and like maggots and disease and things like that. But it's definitely not over the top, and it never felt gratuitous. It felt very real to life of the characters and the nature of the story. The one thing that I would say in terms of the way this book dealt with myth and mythology, towards the end of the book I found that it became a little bit more clunky with its kind of name-droppinginess of the different myths. It became a lot less seamless as we got further into the story, and you would have these passages where Rhiann's just comparing herself to a figure, or like, I wonder if this is how this figure felt at this time, and it becomes a lot less subtle. So I do feel like maybe we could have pared some of those back a little bit, because at the beginning of the novel they felt really tightly woven into the story. They felt like a big part of both of the characters' upbringings, whereas later down the line, when we sort of stopped looking back in time so much, it became a little bit less neat in the way that it was injected into the story. So that was my one sort of drawback, or my one criticism of the book. But overall I had a really good time with it, and I would really recommend, if you're someone who wants to read folk horror, if you like that kind of rural setting in your horror, then I think you would really enjoy this one. And I think it would be quite a nice starting point potentially for someone who isn't as familiar with the Welsh myths. As I said, the author gives you a lot of context throughout without making it feel very plonked into the story. It's much more seamless in that the characters are telling each other stories or inheriting stories from their families and things like that. So yeah, I enjoyed this one a lot, and I'm excited to read more horror, so I'm really pleased that I ended up picking up a copy of Honeysuckle. It's the last thing that I'm going to be tackling for this vlog, so I'll probably just come back to you with one final update when I have read this. I haven't started it yet. My plan is to start it tonight, and I'm really excited. Like, the idea of a kind of feminist horror twist on the myth of Blodeuwedd really intrigues me. So I'll get back to you when I have finished Honeysuckle, and then I think we'll wrap up the vlog there. Hi bookish people. It's been a while since we've spoken. It took me over 2 weeks to finish reading Honeysuckle. To my great shame. I am in quite a bit of a reading slump at the minute, and unfortunately I do think that Honeysuckle is partially to blame for that. This is just not the book that I was expecting it to be, and so that tempered my enjoyment of it quite a lot. So we'll get into the reasons why it wasn't quite what I wanted the book to be. The core premise, you have this boy, Rory, and his sister Wyn. They live in a forest on the outskirts of a village in this fantasy world, and for whatever reason they've been like completely abandoned by their parents. I don't know if that's just like standard practice in this world, that wealthy parents can just like bugger off and leave their children with their staff and nothing ever like comes of that. That was quite a jarring aspect of the narrative, is that Rory and Wyn's parents have basically just abandoned them, and they just have like a housemaid who comes by and a tutor, and that's it. And nobody ever like reports this to the authorities. Like there's never any kind of involvement of any social services or anything like that. These kids have just been left. And that's just never really like delved into in the narrative of the story. But anyway, because of this, they have quite an isolated and lonely upbringing. And as Wyn is that much older than Rory, they start to experience a bit of a distancing in their relationship. Rory is still quite young at this point, and he's constantly badgering Wyn to be with him, to play with him, whatever. Wyn is getting ready to take the entrance exams for this kind of prestigious university that's in a city like a decent way away from their home. And so she doesn't really have time for Rory's games and such anymore. So she decides to create him a Blodeuwedd. And this is the first point of the novel that I found quite difficult to contend with. In this world, Blodeuwedds are a known concept. So it kind of took away from this mystical, unexplained folk setting that I was expecting. And instead we are, for large parts of the novel, thrust into this much more like dark academia kind of world where Wyn and later on in the novel Rory end up spending a lot of time at this university in the library, involved in research. And this world is kind of built around these things called constructs that are like humanoid automatons, I think. They're not really very well explained, and I could never really visualize them, and they're kind of like superfluous to the story aside from mentions in academic settings, like when they're attending lectures and doing research and whatnot. But a lot of menial labour type jobs like factory work and things like that have been assigned to these constructs. And then a kind of another level above that is you have Blodeuwedds which are also made out of natural materials, as I believe the constructs are, but they are much closer to sort of human beings, and they look like people, although there is something kind of like different and otherworldly about them that makes them quite distinct from people, I guess, on sight. They are like a known thing that exists in the world that people can create, and there is kind of like ethical debate around whether they should be created, because what they essentially are is, I guess, a companion of sorts that is designed to fulfill the whims of their creator. So I kind of went into this expecting it to be a bit more folk horror leaning, and instead it was very academic, very kind of scientific. There was a lot of research and science-esque concepts being thrown around by the characters, and it kind of took away from some of the magic of it, if that makes sense. Like, even though they're kind of discussing magic, I suppose, it didn't feel very magical. It felt very academic. So if you're someone who loves dark academia, then you might really, really love this. And I don't necessarily dislike dark academia. It's not a genre I find myself reaching for very much, and it's not a genre that I've read a lot historically. So I don't have anything against it, but it's just not what I was expecting when I was going into this. I was expecting this kind of gritty, isolated setting. The setting of the forest is described incredibly beautifully, to the point where the novel doesn't start to feel horrific until like maybe a good 2/3 of the way through, when Rory is like in late adolescence and his intentions around the Blodeuwedd start to become questionable. Like, it just felt like this kind of magical endless summer in parts. Like this, you know, it really did make the setting feel very beautiful, which I think took away from some of the horror aspects to it. Like, even in the depths of winter, the description is very luscious and not very eerie, which is what I would kind of expect from an isolated rural setting. You didn't really get that vibe. Another issue I had was the pacing of this. It took me almost 2 weeks to get through the first sort of third of the book. And then I was like, right, I'm really getting sick of this now. And I refused to DNF because I didn't want to end the vlog there. It would be quite a disappointing ending for me and for anyone who's watching. So I decided to power through, and I've spent this past weekend just like powering through the last sort of 200 pages or so of the book. I definitely found there to be a tonal shift between sort of the first half and the second half of the novel. I think a lot of the first half could have been done away with, to be honest. I think there was a bit of a struggle in the world building, in that Bar Fridman-Tell clearly had a lot of ideas, but she didn't really go as far as she could with them in terms of the world building, in terms of building this setting that relies on constructed beings. And so I found it difficult to picture. We spent a lot of time in this city with this university setting, but the city itself is never really described. Like, a lot of the settings outside of the forest where Rory and Wyn are from are described in significantly less detail. So it was hard to ever picture yourself there. Like, all of the description was very much centered around the forest. So even though we spend good chunks of the book in this city called St. Clair, I think, I couldn't visualize it. I never felt like I was really there. And yeah, like, I think a lot of that either needed to be developed significantly more and make this a longer novel, or just pare it right back and leave some element of mystery around the creation of Day, the Blodeuwedd that is created by Wyn for Rory. Another element I struggled with in particular in the first half to 2/3 of the book is the author uses these kind of like double-barreled adjectives a lot. Like, everything is autumn red or winter blue or some other type of description, and like, on its own that's fine, but like, she would be doing that and using those kind of like pairs of adjectives that are like connected with an M dash. Like, at one point I think I read like 3 of them on one page, and I was like, this feels really repetitive now. And it was almost like the writing was a bit overwritten, particularly in the descriptions of the forest and of like Day's appearance. The description of Day got very repetitive. Like, the author referred to her branch bones, again with a dash, multiple times, and so it felt very repetitive and it didn't flow very nicely because I kept being caught short by these like repetitions of the same types of descriptors over and over again. So yeah, ultimately those things did detract from my enjoyment of the novel. Having said that, I did enjoy the ending quite a lot. I'm happy enough that I finished it. I think it's one of those books where I could kind of take it or leave it. Like, I'm happy that I finished it because it meant that I got to the end of this vlog finally. But if I hadn't finished it, I wouldn't have felt like I missed out on anything particularly. But the ending was fairly satisfying. It very much ties into the myth of Blodeuwedd, and birds are a huge theme in the second half of the novel. They become very important to Day's character, and the ending plays with that and turns this kind of transformation idea on its head and turns it into a tale of achieving personal freedom, as opposed to in the original myth where it is a punishment and it is supposed to be an isolating punishment. Day, in contrast to that, has been isolated for her whole existence up until the point where she begins to kind of almost become in community with birds in particular. Like, she's always very connected to nature, and like rabbits flock to her and stuff for some reason. But when she starts to become intertwined with the birds in the setting, that's when she really starts to kind of find community for the first time. And they ultimately are an intrinsic part of her achieving her freedom from this prison that Rory ends up kind of creating for her come the end. It does get quite dark towards the end. Like, it didn't feel like a horror until maybe 200 pages in. And then Rory's intentions around Day become a lot more dubious. At the beginning, all of his research that he's doing into Blodeuwedd is very much centered around the idea of keeping Day safe, because they have close calls when she's young and he's young, where she almost rots away completely. And so he becomes very obsessed with finding ways to make her transitions between the seasons safer, but then that becomes a lot more sinister as his intentions around Day become different as he hits adolescence. And the novel then really starts to play with this idea of consent and how we consent, how consent can be gained, how consent can be manipulated, and whether these Blodeuwedd really can ever give consent or not. So it was playing with some interesting themes, but I think overall just the execution of it wasn't there for me, unfortunately. But like I said, if you're someone who loves a dark academia type of novel, you'd probably really enjoy this one. The research aspect and the library setting and things like that are probably going to really appeal to you. And that's not to say that they don't appeal to me. I just went into this, I think, expecting a more folk horror-esque novel with a bit more mystery around it. And the fact that Bar Fridman-Tell decided to make the concept of Day's creation much more scientific in nature and much more explained within the novel just took away a little bit of the magic of the myth, for me, personally. But having said that, I'm still really excited to read more Welsh myth retellings. And I've actually, in conversations with friends, come across a few more examples of books that are forthcoming or have just been published that retell some of these myths. So in the future, I'm going to be looking out for The Bloody Branch by Bridget Lowe, which has already been published. And this takes the 3 central women from the 4th branch of the Mabinogion and turns them into the heroines of the story. I believe it's some kind of uprising of the other world, perhaps, and they have to kind of thwart it. I haven't read too much of the synopsis because I don't want to have too many expectations going into it, but I know that it really takes these 3 kind of maligned women from that story, from the Mabinogion, and makes them the heroines of the piece. So I'm very excited to pick that one up. And then I think in November there's a new novel coming from Finn Longman, who I haven't read before, but whose work I'm very interested in, and that is The Animals We Became, which is another retelling of the 4th branch of the Mabinogion, but I think it focuses much more on the punishments of Gwydion and Gwledd being like turned into animals and stuff. I think it focuses much more on that because I've heard that it is like a queer and trans retelling of that story. And given the way that that story already does play with gender, I am assuming that that's the story, the part of the story that the author is going to explore. So that's really exciting. And then the final book, I don't know much about at all. It's the forthcoming novel from Lucy Holland, who has previously written Sister Song and Song of the Huntress, which are 2 books that are already published that also feature and retell sort of like English medieval myths, I believe, or like Celtic, British, old myths. I haven't read either of them yet, but I do have Sister Song on my TBR. It's literally like there looking at me going, read me, and I will, I soon, I promise. I don't know much about this one. I know that it's finally been given a name, and that is the last verse of The Harp Lord, and on her Substack Lucy Holland has described it as her gay Welsh medieval bard book, which I think sounds fantastic, and I will be picking it up based on that descriptor alone. So very excited to pick up those 3 books in particular, but also just to carry on my research into Welsh mythology. I've had such a good time making this video for you. I definitely want to set myself more personal curriculums in future. This has been such a fun way to approach reading, and I feel like I've learned so much, and I've really enjoyed all of the resources that I've kind of thrown myself into. I've enjoyed discovering new films, I've enjoyed discovering new authors, I've enjoyed learning about classic myths in a more wide-ranging kind of way. Like in the past I would have probably just read a myth and been like, well, most of that went over my head, on to the next book. So it's been nice to really sit with the myths and read them, but also read around them, see how they've been retold in modern context. So yeah, I've had a really great time, and I will definitely be doing this in future. I may vlog it. Having made a vlog for this has kept me really accountable to see the project through. So yeah, like let me know in the comments if you would like to see similar kind of personal curriculum, research focused vlog content from me, because I think I would definitely be up for making more. I think this has been a really fun time for me, so I hope it has for you too. If you've done a similar thing and set a personal curriculum for yourself, I would love to know, like, let me know in the comments if you've done this kind of thing and what you studied and what you got out of it. I would be really keen to hear that. I will be back again sometime in the future for another vlog, but until then, stay safe and happy reading.